Low mounds of sun-baked brick rise out of the Iraqi desert, some barely taller than a person, scattered across a plain that looks, to an untrained eye passing through, like nothing more than ordinary desert terrain interrupted by the occasional lump of eroded earth. Underneath those mounds sits what was, for most of 1,000 years, the largest and most powerful city the world had yet produced, a capital whose name was so synonymous with wealth, excess, and imperial might that later writers borrowed it as shorthand for civilization at its most seductive and most dangerous. The prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before the city's final decline, predicted that Babylon would never again be inhabited, that no tent would be pitched there and no shepherd would rest his flocks among its ruins, a prediction ancient enough that it long predates the actual slow collapse it seems, with unsettling accuracy, to describe. No single army burned this city to the ground in one final catastrophic night. No earthquake swallowed it whole. Babylon's ending was something stranger and, in its own way, more difficult to fully explain, a gradual withdrawal of relevance stretching across centuries until one of history's most famous cities simply stopped being anywhere anyone particularly needed to go. Historians studying comparable cases of ancient urban decline generally distinguish between cities destroyed suddenly through war or natural disaster and cities that experienced this slower, more gradual kind of abandonment, a distinction that matters much for how archaeologists interpret the physical evidence each type of ending leaves behind. Sudden destruction typically producing a single, clear destruction layer full of unrecovered household goods abandoned in place, gradual decline instead, producing exactly the kind of thinning, progressively less dense occupation evidence that excavators have documented at Babylon across its own final centuries of active use. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the river. What happened to Babylon between its height under Nebuchadnezzar II, when its walls and gardens counted among the wonders of the ancient world, and its rediscovery buried under desert sand by 19th-century excavators, involves conquest and prophecy, a garden whose very existence historians still cannot fully confirm, and a 20th-century dictator who tried to rebuild the ancient capital with his own name stamped into every brick. Tonight we trace that full arc, and by the end you will understand exactly how a city this famous, this wealthy, and this central to the ancient world's imagination could disappear so completely that later generations argued for over 2,000 years about whether some of its most celebrated wonders had ever actually existed at all. Consider, for a moment, the strangeness of a city ending this way. Most fallen empires leave behind a clear final chapter, a burning capital, a last king dragged in chains, a date historians can point to and say, "Here, this is when it stopped." Babylon offers no such moment. Its walls stood empty for centuries before anyone thought to write down that they were empty. Its temples kept a handful of priests working through rituals for a dwindling population that grew smaller every generation, until one day, quietly, the very last inscription was carved and no one carved another. That is the specific mystery this documentary sets out to trace. Not a fall, but a fade, and the fade turns out to be notably harder to fully explain than any single dramatic ending would have been. Babylon's rise to true imperial prominence began under Hammurabi, who ruled the city beginning around 1792 BCE and who transformed what had previously been a comparatively minor city-state along the Euphrates River into the dominant power across Mesopotamia, conquering rival city-states and consolidating an empire whose administrative and legal foundations would influence the region for centuries after his own reign ended. Hammurabi's military campaigns unfolded gradually across nearly 3 decades of his reign rather than through any single decisive conquest, the king building alliances, breaking them when strategically convenient, and picking off rival Mesopotamian powers one at a time in a patient, methodical pattern of expansion that historians have noted bears a resemblance to the kind of incremental empire building later practiced by much more famous conquerors working in entirely different historical periods, a reminder that Hammurabi's own reputation today rests disproportionately on his law code rather than on the military campaigns that actually made Babylon powerful enough to produce and enforce that code across a really substantial territory in the first place. Hammurabi's most enduring legacy, at least in terms of what survives for modern historians to examine directly, is the law code bearing his name, inscribed on a black stone stele nearly 2.5 meters tall and covered with nearly 300 legal provisions addressing everything from property disputes and commercial contracts to criminal punishment and family law, organized according to a principle of proportional justice that modern readers recognize immediately in the phrase an eye for an eye, though the actual code applies this principle with notably more nuance and social stratification than that simplified summary usually conveys. This Old Babylonian period, as historians now call the era of Hammurabi's dynasty, established the city's reputation as a center of law, learning, and religious authority that would persist even through the political instability and periodic foreign domination that followed Hammurabi's own death, the city's cultural and religious prestige proving markedly more durable than any single dynasty's political control over it, a pattern that would recur throughout Babylon's long history as different conquering powers came and went while the city itself remained the region's preeminent symbol of civilized authority. Hammurabi's dynasty itself did not long survive him, his successors gradually losing control over the wider empire he had assembled within roughly a century and a half of his own death, a decline culminating in the Hittite sack of Babylon around 1595 BCE, a raid conducted by a Hittite king operating from Anatolia far to the north whose forces struck the city, looted its wealth, and then withdrew entirely rather than attempting to hold the territory permanently, leaving a power vacuum that Kassite rulers would eventually fill, establishing the long Middle Dynasty discussed above. Centuries of subsequent political turbulence followed, including periods of Kassite, Assyrian, and Elamite domination during which Babylon's political fortunes rose and fell markedly, the city sometimes serving as an independent power and sometimes existing as a subordinate, if still culturally prestigious, possession under rulers based elsewhere. A long middle period in the city's history that receives much less popular attention than either its founding glory under Hammurabi or its later peak under the Neo-Babylonian kings, but that nonetheless shaped the religious institutions, urban infrastructure, and administrative traditions that later Babylonian rulers would inherit and build upon. Hammurabi's law code, though the most famous surviving example, was not actually the first legal code produced in Mesopotamia, drawing substantially on earlier legal traditions established by Sumerian and Akkadian rulers in preceding centuries, a point worth noting since it complicates the popular image of Hammurabi as a singular legal innovator working from nothing, when the more accurate picture involves a ruler consolidating, systematizing, and publicly monumentalizing legal principles that had already been developing across Mesopotamian civilization for generations before his own reign began. What made Hammurabi's specific code so historically consequential was less its originality than its scale, its comprehensiveness, and the deliberate decision to inscribe it on a public monument where any literate subject, and plenty of illiterate ones relying on others to read it aloud, could in principle access its provisions directly. A form of public legal transparency that few, if any, comparable ancient societies attempted with this level of deliberate, monumental permanence. The single most dramatic episode in this long middle period arrived in 689 BCE, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib, having grown sufficiently frustrated with repeated Babylonian rebellions against Assyrian authority, ordered the systematic destruction of the city itself, an act ancient inscriptions describe in terms of real, deliberate thoroughness, walls torn down, temples burned, and, according to Sennacherib's own inscriptions, the waters of the Euphrates diverted to flood the city's ruins. A punishment intended not merely to defeat Babylon, but to erase it from meaningful existence entirely. Sennacherib's own account of this destruction, preserved in Assyrian royal inscriptions, describes the religious dimension of the act with striking bluntness. The king claiming to have removed the city's patron deity Marduk from his temple and carried the god's statue away as a captive, a symbolic act intended to demonstrate that even Babylon's divine protector had been defeated alongside its human population. A claim that reveals how thoroughly ancient Mesopotamian political and religious authority remained intertwined, since destroying a city's temples and removing its gods represented, within this worldview, a more complete victory than simple military conquest alone could achieve. This destruction, however, proved far from permanent. Sennacherib's own son and eventual successor Esarhaddon reversed his father's policy almost immediately upon taking the Assyrian throne, undertaking a substantial rebuilding program that restored Babylon's temples and city walls. A policy shift that historians generally attribute to Esarhaddon's recognition that Babylon's religious and cultural prestige across Mesopotamia made its permanent destruction politically counterproductive regardless of how satisfying that destruction may have felt to his father in the immediate aftermath of repeated rebellion. The city's true golden age, the period most people picture when they imagine ancient Babylon at all, arrived much later, following the collapse of Assyrian imperial power at the end of the 7th century BCE, when a Babylonian general named Nabopolassar successfully threw off Assyrian control and established the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, a new imperial order that would, under his son Nebuchadnezzar II, transform Babylon into the largest and most architecturally magnificent city the ancient world had yet produced. Nabopolassar's own rise deserves attention in its own right, since it represents one of history's clearer examples of an empire collapsing not through a single decisive military defeat, but through a cascading series of rebellions that its own overextended administrative structure could no longer contain. Assyria, having spent generations conquering and administering an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran, had grown too large for its own governing institutions to manage sustainably, and Nabopolassar's revolt succeeded substantially because it coincided with simultaneous pressure from the Medes to the east, a coordinated squeeze that finally broke an empire many observers at the time would have considered permanently unassailable only a generation earlier. Nabopolassar spent much of his own reign consolidating this hard-won independence rather than pursuing further conquest, leaving the truly ambitious building program that would define Babylon's golden age to his son, who inherited a secure, wealthy kingdom and an urgent personal desire to physically demonstrate, through architecture, exactly how thoroughly the balance of power in Mesopotamia had shifted. The fall of Nineveh itself in 612 BCE, achieved through the combined military campaign of Nabopolassar's Babylonian forces and their Median allies, effectively ended Assyrian imperial power forever, the once mighty Assyrian capital reduced so thoroughly that later Greek writers, encountering its ruins generations afterward, struggled to accurately identify which specific mound of rubble had once housed the empire that had dominated the entire ancient Near East for centuries, a historical irony. Worth noting given that Babylon itself would eventually experience something structurally similar, if far more gradual, in the centuries following its own golden age under Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar himself, once he inherited the throne, moved quickly to secure his father's gains through his own decisive military action, most notably defeating an Egyptian army at Carchemish in 605 BCE in a battle that eliminated the last serious external threat to Babylonian control over the Levant, clearing the way for the extended and largely uninterrupted building program that would occupy much of the remaining 4 decades of his own reign. Nebuchadnezzar II, ruling from 605 to 562 BCE, undertook a building program of extraordinary scale, rebuilding and expanding Babylon's fortifications, temples, and palaces until the city occupied an area historians estimate at roughly 900 hectares, protected by double walls thick enough, according to the Greek historian Herodotus writing notably later, for a 4-horse chariot to turn around comfortably along their top, a claim modern archaeologists treat with appropriate skepticism regarding its precise accuracy, while nonetheless confirming that the walls genuinely were massive by any ancient standard. Herodotus never actually visited Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period he describes, writing his account well over a century after Nebuchadnezzar's own death and drawing on second-hand reports and local tradition current during his own later visit to the region. A gap between eyewitness reality and recorded description that modern historians must weigh carefully whenever using Herodotus as a source for Babylon's precise physical dimensions, even as archaeological excavation has confirmed. Enough of his broader description to establish that his account, however embellished in specific details, was not simply invented from nothing. The most visually spectacular surviving element of Nebuchadnezzar's building program is the Ishtar Gate, one of 8 monumental gates providing controlled access through the city's inner walls, its surface covered in glazed brick tiles depicting alternating rows of bulls and dragons rendered in vivid blue, yellow, and white against a deep blue background. A decorative technique requiring considerable technical sophistication to produce reliably at this scale, and one that survived well enough, in fragments recovered by later excavators, to allow a substantial reconstruction now displayed prominently in a major European museum. Beyond the gate itself, a broad processional way called Iibershabu ran through the heart of the city, its walls similarly decorated with glazed brick reliefs depicting lions in mid-stride, used during major religious festivals to carry ceremonial statues of the gods through the city in elaborate public procession. A route designed explicitly to overwhelm anyone walking it with continuous visual evidence of royal wealth and divine favor working in close, deliberate coordination, each lion rendered in a slightly different stride and posture despite the repeating overall pattern, a small but telling detail suggesting individual craftsmen were given genuine latitude within the broader decorative scheme rather than simply stamping out identical copies along the entire length of the wall. The Etemenanke Ziggurat, a massive stepped temple tower dedicated to Marduk and rebuilt substantially under Nebuchadnezzar's patronage, rose an estimated 90 meters above the surrounding city, its stepped form and religious function widely believed by biblical scholars to have inspired the Tower of Babel narrative recorded in the Book of Genesis, a connection that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, reflects how thoroughly Babylon's monumental architecture impressed itself upon the broader ancient Near Eastern imagination well beyond the city's own borders and well beyond its own lifetime as an active religious center. Nebuchadnezzar's own building inscriptions, remarkably detailed and remarkably self-congratulatory even by the standards of ancient royal propaganda, describe the specific quantities of materials involved in these projects with an accountant's precision: cedar beams imported from Lebanon, gold leaf applied to temple doors, bronze figures cast for ceremonial display. A level of documented material extravagance that helps modern historians understand why later Greek and Roman writers, working centuries after the fact and relying substantially on second-hand reports, found Babylon such fertile ground for increasingly exaggerated legend. The king who built walls a chariot could supposedly turn around upon, who plated temple doors in gold, who diverted a portion of his own kingdom's wealth into decorative brick glazing on a scale no prior Mesopotamian ruler had attempted, gave later storytellers an entirely accurate factual foundation on which to build stories that would, over subsequent centuries, grow markedly taller than even Nebuchadnezzar's own impressive achievements. The scale of labor mobilization these projects required, drawing on both Babylonian subjects and, according to biblical and other ancient sources, considerable numbers of foreign deportees, including the Judean captives discussed later in this account, made Nebuchadnezzar's building program one of the largest coordinated construction efforts anywhere in the ancient world during his own lifetime. A workforce numbering in the tens of thousands across the full span of his reign, organized through an administrative apparatus sophisticated enough to feed, house, and direct this labor force across decades of continuous major construction. No feature associated with ancient Babylon has generated more sustained fascination or more real scholarly controversy than the Hanging Gardens, listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world by later Greek writers and described in surviving accounts as an artificial mountain of terraced greenery. irrigated by an ingenious system that lifted water from the Euphrates to nourish trees and plants growing at considerable height above the surrounding city, reportedly built by Nebuchadnezzar, to comfort a homesick wife who missed the mountainous green landscape of her native land. The remarkably striking problem with this famous story is that no surviving Babylonian cuneiform inscription from Nebuchadnezzar's own reign, a period extensively documented through royal building records that meticulously catalog virtually every other major construction project he undertook, mentions the Hanging Gardens at all, an absence that becomes much more difficult to dismiss as simple record-keeping oversight once historians recognize how thoroughly documented every other comparable structure from this same reign actually is. Every ancient account describing the Hanging Gardens in detail comes from Greek and Roman writers working centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death, most citing earlier, now lost sources rather than direct first-hand knowledge, a chain of transmission that has led a significant body of modern scholarship, most prominently the research of British Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, to propose an alternative explanation entirely, that the gardens ancient writers described may have actually been built not at Babylon at all, but at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, by King Sennacherib roughly a century earlier, with later Greek sources simply confusing the two great Mesopotamian cities and misattributing a well-documented Assyrian garden to the more famous Babylonian king instead. Daly's argument rests substantially on Assyrian inscriptions from Sennacherib's own reign describing an elaborate palace garden at Nineveh featuring exactly the kind of innovative water-lifting technology, likely an early screw-based irrigation mechanism, that later Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens specifically describe, evidence that, while compelling to a considerable number of specialists in the field, has not achieved anything close to unanimous scholarly consensus, meaning the honest answer to where the Hanging Gardens actually stood, or whether they existed in the specific form later legend describes at all, remains one of ancient history's more still open questions rather than a settled matter modern archaeology has definitively resolved. Excavators working directly at the Babylon site itself have identified one structure near the palace complex, a building with unusually thick walls and evidence of a specialized water system, that some archaeologists, including Coldway himself, once proposed as a possible physical location for the gardens. Though this identification has never achieved the kind of confident consensus that would settle the underlying controversy, and subsequent researchers examining the same structure have offered competing interpretations ranging from a storage facility to an administrative building with no connection to elaborate horticulture at all. What makes this particular archaeological puzzle truly fascinating, rather than simply frustrating, is what it reveals about the limits of even remarkably well-preserved ancient evidence, since Babylon's palace district has been excavated more thoroughly than almost any comparable Mesopotamian site. And even that thoroughness has proven insufficient to settle a question this specific and this significant for how modern audiences understand one of antiquity's most famous wonders. Whichever explanation eventually proves correct, if any single explanation ever fully does, the Hanging Gardens controversy offers a useful lesson about how ancient reputation and ancient reality can drift apart across the centuries, separating an actual historical event from the surviving written accounts describing it, since even a structure this famous, this frequently described, and this central to popular understanding of ancient Babylon rests, when examined closely, on a chain of second-hand and third-hand ancient testimony considerably shakier than most casual readers of Seven Wonders lists would ever suspect, a pattern of legend outrunning documented fact that recurs, in various forms, throughout the broader history of how ancient wonders came to be remembered by later generations working with incomplete and sometimes badly garbled source material. The wider list of Seven Wonders itself, compiled by various ancient authors with somewhat differing selections depending on the specific source consulted, generally included alongside the Hanging Gardens such structures as the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Lighthouse of Alexandria, all sharing the common feature of being described by writers who had, in most cases, never personally seen the wonder in question, relying instead on earlier travelers' accounts passed down and periodically embellished across generations, a pattern of transmission that makes the Hanging Gardens case much less unusual within this broader ancient tradition than it might initially appear. Religious life in Babylon centered on the god Marduk, whose temple complex Esagila stood at the heart of the city adjacent to the towering Etemenanke ziggurat, and whose annual Akitu festival, celebrated at the Spring New Year, represented one of the most elaborate and most politically significant religious ceremonies anywhere in the ancient Near East. A multi-day celebration during which the king's own legitimacy to rule was symbolically renewed through a ritual in which the high priest struck the king across the face and pulled his ears, a deliberate humiliation the king was required to accept without resistance as proof of his continued humility before the god whose favor sustained his earthly authority. If the king wept real tears during this ritual humiliation, ancient religious commentary held that Marduk had accepted his continued rule for the coming year, while a dry-eyed king risked being interpreted as having lost divine favor entirely, a striking example of how thoroughly Babylonian kingship depended on public ritual performance rather than purely military or hereditary claims to legitimacy. The king's own body and visible emotional response becoming, once a year, a direct instrument of state religious theater witnessed by the assembled priesthood and, by extension, the wider population whose confidence in his rule depended substantially on how convincingly he performed this required annual humiliation. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's great creation epic, recited in full during the Akitu festival, describes Marduk's rise to supremacy among the Mesopotamian gods through his defeat of the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat, a narrative that scholars have long recognized as serving a political function beyond its purely religious content, legitimizing Babylon's own political supremacy across Mesopotamia by establishing, in cosmic and mythological terms, that the city's patron deity had earned his position at the head of the divine pantheon through the same kind of decisive victory over chaos and disorder that Babylonian kings claimed to provide for their own human subjects. Surviving copies of the Enuma Elish, recovered in multiple versions from different periods across Babylon's long history, show the text being periodically updated and adapted to reflect shifting political circumstances, evidence that this was a living religious document actively maintained by generations of priests rather than a fixed, unchanging text preserved purely for its own sake. Babylon's scholarly and scientific reputation extended well beyond religious ritual alone, the city serving as a true center for astronomical observation and mathematical calculation, Babylonian astronomers maintaining systematic records of celestial observations across many centuries that allowed them to predict eclipses and planetary movements with an accuracy that later Greek astronomers, including figures working centuries afterward, explicitly acknowledged, drawing upon a scientific tradition whose surviving cuneiform tablets continue providing modern historians of astronomy with some of the oldest systematic observational data anywhere in the historical record. Daily life within the city, reconstructed substantially through the enormous volume of surviving administrative and legal cuneiform tablets recovered from Babylon and related sites, reveals a cosmopolitan urban population engaged in commerce, craft production, and legal transactions documented with a level of bureaucratic detail that gives modern historians unusually direct access to the economic texture of ordinary Babylonian life, rental agreements, marriage contracts, and commercial partnerships recorded with a specificity that makes Babylon, alongside a handful of other well-documented ancient Mesopotamian cities, one of the better understood urban populations anywhere in the pre-classical ancient world. Women in Babylonian society, based on the surviving legal tablets, held property rights and legal standing notably more substantial than popular assumptions about ancient patriarchal societies might suggest, able to own and manage real estate, enter into business contracts independently, and, in certain documented circumstances, initiate divorce proceedings against their husbands, though these rights existed within a broader social framework that remained, in most other respects, clearly organized around male authority within both household and civic life. Specific archives recovered from Babylon document women running businesses independently, including at least one well-documented case of a female entrepreneur managing a substantial commercial operation involving textile production and trade, evidence that the economic life of the city, whatever its formal legal and religious hierarchies, accommodated a notably wider range of individual circumstance and opportunity than the more generalized ancient stereotypes many modern readers carry into their first encounter with Mesopotamian history. Babylon's fall as an independent imperial capital came in 539 BCE, when the Persian king Cyrus the Great, having already built an empire stretching across much of the ancient Near East, turned his attention to the Neo-Babylonian kingdom then ruled by Nabonidus, a king whose own religious policies, particularly his apparent favoritism toward the moon god Sin over Babylon's traditional patron deity Marduk, had reportedly generated considerable resentment among the city's own priestly establishment well before any Persian army actually arrived at the gates. Nabonidus himself remains one of the more really puzzling figures in Neo-Babylonian history, spending extended years of his own reign residing far from Babylon at the desert oasis of Tama in northern Arabia for reasons ancient sources describe only vaguely, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern the capital as regent during these lengthy royal absences, an unusual arrangement for a Mesopotamian king that historians have proposed various explanations for, ranging from genuine religious devotion to the moon god centered at Tama to more practical strategic considerations involving control over valuable desert trade routes, without any single explanation achieving full scholarly consensus. The biblical book of Daniel preserves the most famous popular account of Babylon's fall, describing a lavish royal feast held by Belshazzar, son of Nabonidus and serving as regent during his father's extended absence from the capital, interrupted by mysterious handwriting appearing on the palace wall that the prophet Daniel alone could interpret. A message announcing that Belshazzar's kingdom had been weighed and found wanting and would soon be divided between the Medes and Persians, a dramatic narrative that has embedded the phrase "writing on the wall" permanently into everyday English usage, even among readers with no particular interest in the underlying ancient history the story describes. The actual historical circumstances surrounding Babylon's fall appear, based on surviving Babylonian and Persian sources examined together, to have involved markedly less dramatic violence than the biblical account's vivid imagery might suggest, with the Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscription commissioned by Cyrus himself following his conquest, explicitly presenting the Persian king's arrival as a peaceful liberation welcomed by Babylon's own population and priesthood, weary of Nabonidus's unpopular religious policies, rather than a violently contested military siege, a self-serving royal narrative, certainly, but one that finds some corroboration in the relative absence of archaeological evidence for widespread destruction dating to precisely this transitional period. Persian rule brought actual continuity rather than the kind of systematic destruction Babylon had suffered under Sennacherib generations earlier, Cyrus and his successors generally maintaining the city's temples, administrative structures, and considerable regional prestige even as ultimate political authority shifted decisively toward the new Persian imperial center, Babylon continuing to function as one of the Achaemenid Empire's most important administrative and economic centers for the following 2 centuries, its scholarly and religious institutions remaining active and its population continuing to prosper under a new set of distant, foreign rulers. Babylon's continued administrative importance under Persian rule is reflected in surviving records showing the city served, for extended periods, as a royal residence in its own right, Persian kings periodically holding court there and conducting official business from Babylon's own ancient palace complex rather than treating the city as a purely provincial backwater stripped of all meaningful political function, a level of continued royal attention that helps explain why the city's core institutions remain so well maintained across 2 full centuries of foreign Persian rule. Alexander the Great's arrival in Babylon in 331 BCE, following his decisive defeat of the Persian king Darius III, brought the city briefly back into the center of world political attention, Alexander reportedly entering the city to an enthusiastic welcome from its population and explicitly announcing plans to restore and rebuild Babylon's temples. including the massive Etamananke ziggurat, which had fallen into disrepair across the preceding 2 centuries of Persian rule, and to establish the city as a major administrative center, possibly even the capital, for his own rapidly expanding empire. Foreign merchants and travelers passing through Babylon encountered a multilingual commercial environment. Cuneiform tablets recording transactions in Akkadian alongside Aramaic notations that had, by the later Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods, become the practical everyday language of much of the wider population, even as Akkadian retained its position as the formal language of religious and royal inscription, a linguistic layering that mirrors the city's broader role as a real crossroads, where merchants, scholars, and travelers from across the ancient Near East regularly conducted business, exchanged ideas, and, in some documented cases, settled permanently within Babylon's own diverse urban population. Temple administrators, called shatamu, managed vast economic operations extending well beyond narrow religious duty, overseeing agricultural estates, herds of livestock, and workshops producing textiles and metal goods on a scale that made major temple institutions like a sagala among the largest employers and largest economic actors anywhere in the city, a fusion of religious and economic authority typical of ancient Mesopotamian temples generally, but reaching particular scale within Babylon's own long-established religious establishment. The famous banking family, known through surviving records as the Ejibai Archive, spanning several generations of the same Babylonian family conducting loans, property transactions, and commercial partnerships across more than a century, offers modern historians one of the clearest surviving pictures anywhere in the ancient world of how a private commercial dynasty actually operated, their meticulously kept records surviving in numbers sufficient to reconstruct individual family members' business careers in genuine, granular detail, evidence of financial sophistication that predates comparable European banking institutions by well over 2,000 years. Ancient sources describe Alexander personally touring Babylon's ruined ziggurat and ordering the site cleared of rubble in preparation for reconstruction, a project reportedly employing 10,000 laborers according to some ancient accounts, work that had barely begun before Alexander's own death brought the entire restoration effort to a permanent halt, leaving the great temple tower that had once inspired biblical legend never fully rebuilt, its cleared foundation eventually becoming, in a sense, its own separate ruin distinct from the tower that had originally stood there. These ambitious restoration plans, along with virtually every other long-term project Alexander initiated during his final years, were cut short by his sudden death in Babylon itself in June of 323 BCE, likely from illness, though ancient sources preserve persistent rumors of poisoning that modern historians generally treat with considerable skepticism given the absence of any compelling supporting evidence beyond the understandable suspicion that inevitably surrounds the unexpected death of any young, powerful ruler. Following Alexander's death, Babylon became, briefly, one of the central prizes contested among his surviving generals during the chaotic wars of succession that followed, before eventually passing under the control of Seleucus, one of Alexander's most capable former commanders, whose Seleucid dynasty would go on to rule an extensive empire stretching across much of the former Persian territory Alexander had conquered, a settlement reached only after years of shifting alliances and open warfare. Among Alexander's former officers, each maneuvering to claim as large a share as possible of an empire none of them had ever expected to inherit so suddenly. The decision that ultimately proved most consequential for Babylon's long-term future arrived when Seleucus founded a new city, Seleucia on the Tigris, positioned strategically along a different river and deliberately intended to serve as the new empire's primary administrative capital, a decision that historians generally interpret as reflecting both practical logistical considerations. Seleucia's position offering better access to trade routes and communication networks across the wider Seleucid territory, and a more calculated political motive, establishing a genuinely new capital city unburdened by Babylon's deep, centuries-old association with prior, now superseded imperial dynasties that Seleucus himself had no direct ancestral connection to. Ancient sources describe Seleucus actively encouraging, and in some accounts effectively compelling, portions of Babylon's own population to relocate to the new capital, a policy that, whatever specific mixture of persuasion and pressure it actually involved, accelerated the demographic drain that would define Babylon's following centuries far more decisively than any single military defeat could have managed. Within a generation of Seleucia's founding, Babylon had already ceded its position as the region's primary population center, and the specific irony embedded in this transition deserves acknowledgement. That the city which had for so long absorbed and outlasted conquering dynasty after conquering dynasty finally began its true decline not through violent conquest but through the comparatively mundane administrative decision of one ambitious general choosing to build somewhere else instead. Seleucia's founding initiated what historians now recognize as the beginning of Babylon's long, gradual decline, a process that unfolded across several subsequent centuries rather than through any single decisive event, as the new city drew away population, commercial activity, and administrative importance that had previously concentrated in ancient Babylon itself. A slow migration of both people and imperial attention that left the older city increasingly peripheral to the major political and economic developments unfolding across the wider region. Babylonian cuneiform tablets continued being produced at the city for a remarkably long period after this initial decline began, the very last known cuneiform astronomical text dating to 75 CE. Evidence that scholarly and religious institutions maintaining this ancient literary and scientific tradition persisted in Babylon far longer than the city's overall political and economic importance might otherwise suggest, a testament to the institutional durability of Babylonian temple scholarship. Even as the wider city around these institutions grew progressively smaller and progressively less significant within the broader Mesopotamian political landscape, these final generations of Babylonian scribes, working within a shrinking city that had already lost its political relevance centuries earlier, nonetheless maintains scholarly standards precise enough that modern astronomers can still verify their recorded eclipse predictions against known celestial mechanics, a continuity of exact scientific practice sustained by an ever smaller community of specialists who kept training successors in an increasingly obscure craft long after most of the wider world had stopped paying attention to Babylon at all. By the time the region came under Parthian control during the following centuries, ancient geographical writers describing Babylon consistently note a city already substantially reduced from its former imperial grandeur. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the millennium, explicitly describing Babylon as largely deserted, its famous walls and monumental buildings already crumbling into ruin, a description that, whatever exaggeration a writer working within the broader Greek literary tradition of describing fallen civilizations might have introduced, nonetheless confirms that Babylon's physical decline was already substantially underway well before the classical era had even fully run its course. The mechanisms driving this long decline combine several overlapping factors that historians continue debating in terms of their relative importance: shifting river courses gradually altering the Euphrates' relationship to the city's original urban layout, the systematic transfer of population and resources toward newer regional capitals under successive ruling dynasties, and simply the ordinary, cumulative erosion that any ancient mud-brick city inevitably experiences once the sustained maintenance investment that originally kept its walls, canals, and buildings functional gradually diminishes and eventually stops entirely. The gradual shift of the Euphrates itself deserves particular attention within this broader picture, since Babylon's entire urban infrastructure, its harbors, its irrigation canals, its very street grid, had been engineered around the river's course as it existed during the Neo-Babylonian period, and Mesopotamian rivers, flowing through flat alluvial plains built from their own accumulated silt deposits, are notoriously prone to gradually shifting their channels over sufficiently long time scales. As the Euphrates slowly migrated away from portions of the ancient city center across the following centuries, the practical infrastructure that had once made Babylon such an effective commercial and administrative hub simply stopped functioning as designed, canals silting up, harbors losing their water access, a slow-motion geographic betrayal that no human decision or policy could have easily reversed, compounding the political and demographic pressures already working against the cities. Continued centrality. Agricultural productivity across the surrounding countryside, which had sustained Babylon's enormous ancient population through an elaborate irrigation network requiring constant, coordinated maintenance across many kilometers of canals and water channels, appears to have declined gradually across these same centuries as well, whether through soil salinization from centuries of intensive irrigation, a well-documented long-term hazard affecting Mesopotamian agriculture generally, or simply through the reduced administrative capacity available to maintain such an elaborate water management system once political attention and resources had substantially relocated toward Seleucia and later regional capitals, a decline in agricultural support capacity that would have made sustaining Babylon's former population scale much more difficult, even setting aside every other factor already discussed. By the time Roman writers and travelers encountered Babylon during the early centuries of the Common Era, the city had become something closer to an antiquarian curiosity than a living urban center, visited by educated travelers specifically because of its famous ancient history, rather than because it retained any contemporary political or commercial significance, a pattern of ruin tourism that finds interesting parallel in how later travelers would approach many other formerly great ancient cities across the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Babylon did periodically rebel against Persian rule across these 2 centuries, most notably during the reign of Xerxes, whose response to a serious Babylonian uprising in 484 BCE involved measures much harsher than his predecessor Cyrus had ever applied, including reportedly removing or destroying certain temple treasures and diminishing some of the city's traditional privileges, a punitive episode that historians have sometimes compared, on a notably smaller scale, to Sennacherib's earlier Assyrian-era destruction, though Xerxes stopped well short of anything resembling the total devastation that earlier Assyrian king had inflicted. Babylon's underlying religious and cultural infrastructure survived this Persian-era punishment relatively intact, a resilience that speaks to how deeply embedded the city's core institutions had become across the many centuries of continuous occupation preceding this particular period of imperial friction. The Cyrus cylinder itself deserves brief additional consideration beyond its role in describing Babylon's fall, since the object has taken on a markedly larger modern symbolic life than its original ancient context alone would suggest, sometimes described in popular and even some official political contexts as history's first declaration of human rights, a characterization that most professional Assyriologists consider an actual overstatement of what is, when read carefully in its original context, a fairly conventional piece of ancient royal propaganda following established Mesopotamian conventions for how a new king justified his own legitimacy to a conquered population, rather than a document articulating anything resembling the modern legal and philosophical concept of universal human rights that later political movements have sometimes claimed it anticipated. The cylinder's actual text does describe Cyrus permitting deported peoples, including the Judean exiles discussed elsewhere in this account, to return to their homelands and rebuild their own temples, a genuine and historically significant policy of religious tolerance by the standards of the ancient world, even if the modern human rights framing sometimes applied to the document retroactively imposes a great deal more sweeping philosophical claim than the original inscription itself ever actually makes. The Roman-era writer Pausanias, describing the region in the 2nd century CE, described Babylon's massive walls as still standing but the city itself as largely empty within them, with only the temple complex dedicated to Marduk apparently remaining in active religious use, a striking image of monumental fortification surrounding a city that had, by this point, shrunk to a small fraction of the population these same walls had originally been built to protect and enclose. This slow physical decline continued across the following centuries of late antiquity, the site gradually accumulating wind-blown sand and the debris of its own crumbling mud brick architecture, a natural process of burial that, however unremarkable in the moment, would eventually prove essential to the site's later archaeological preservation. since the same accumulating desert sand that erased Babylon's visible presence from the landscape also protected substantial portions of its buried architecture and artifacts from the kind of continuous surface exposure, looting, and reuse of building material that has left considerably less intact evidence at many other comparably ancient sites across the wider region. By the time Arab geographers writing during the medieval Islamic period described the region, Babylon existed essentially as a place name attached to scattered ruins rather than any recognizable functioning settlement, its precise physical extent and the location of its most famous monuments already substantially obscured beneath centuries of accumulated sand and sediment. Information that would remain essentially lost to direct physical investigation until European travelers and eventually professional archaeologists began the slow process of rediscovery many centuries later. Medieval Arab geographical writers, including the 10th century traveler and scholar al-Masudi, described the ruins of Babylon as a source of local curiosity and folklore, associating the site with legends of ancient magic and sorcery that had grown up around the once famous city in the absence of any accurate historical understanding of what the ruins actually represented. A pattern of legendary embellishment filling the gap left by true historical knowledge that recurs at abandoned ancient sites across many different cultures and many different centuries whenever accurate documentary memory fails to survive alongside the physical remains themselves. Local communities living near the ruins throughout this long medieval period reportedly avoided certain sections of the site, associating them with jinn and other supernatural dangers, a folk tradition that, whatever its actual origin, had the practical secondary effect of discouraging the kind of casual stone robbing and building material scavenging that stripped many other ancient Mesopotamian sites of much of their surviving architecture during comparable centuries of neglect. Babylon's cultural afterlife proved, in a real irony given the physical city's own gradual disappearance, far more vigorous and much more consequential than its actual archaeological remains for many centuries, the city achieving a kind of permanent symbolic existence within the biblical tradition that would shape Western religious and literary imagination regardless of what was actually happening, or not happening, at the physical site itself. The Tower of Babel narrative in the Book of Genesis, describing humanity's attempt to build a tower reaching to heaven and God's subsequent decision to confuse human language and scatter the builders across the earth, drew directly on Babylon's own towering ziggurat architecture and on the wordplay connecting the city's name to the Hebrew word for confusion, embedding Babylon permanently into the biblical narrative as a symbol of human overreach and divine judgment regardless of the actual historical circumstances surrounding the Etemenanke's own construction. The Babylonian captivity, referring to the forced deportation of a substantial portion of the Jewish population from Jerusalem to Babylon following Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Judah in 597 and 586 BCE, generated a body of biblical literature, most notably substantial portions of the Book of Psalms and the prophetic writings of Ezekiel, that processed this historical trauma into some of the most emotionally powerful religious literature in the entire biblical corpus, including the famous lament. Beginning by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept, a passage whose raw expression of exile and longing has resonated with displaced and oppressed peoples across many subsequent centuries entirely removed from its original ancient Judean context. Archaeological and cuneiform evidence recovered from Babylon itself corroborates portions of this biblical narrative in really striking detail, including ration lists naming a captive Judean king held at the Babylonian court, physical confirmation from the conquering side's own administrative records that lends considerable historical weight to the broader biblical account of exile even where specific details in each tradition do not align perfectly with the other. The Book of Revelation's later apocalyptic imagery of Babylon the Great, portrayed as a corrupt and doomed city representing worldly excess and moral decay destined for divine punishment, drew on this accumulated biblical tradition to transform the actual historical city into something closer to a permanent symbolic archetype, a literary and religious afterlife so thoroughly detached from Babylon's real historical reality that centuries of readers absorbed the symbolic Babylon of Scripture, without necessarily knowing, or particularly needing to know anything substantial about the actual Mesopotamian city whose real history had generated this powerful and enduring metaphor in the first place. This symbolic afterlife proved remarkably persistent across subsequent centuries of Western culture, Babylon becoming a kind of portable metaphor deployed across contexts having nothing whatsoever to do with ancient Mesopotamia itself, later writers and preachers invoking Babylon to describe Rome, describing corrupt contemporary cities, or describing entire modern societies they wished to characterize as decadent and doomed, a rhetorical tradition stretching from medieval religious polemic through to modern popular music, where the word Babylon still carries, for audiences with no particular training in ancient history, an immediately recognizable connotation of glamorous corruption awaiting inevitable collapse. The actual historical city, meanwhile, continued its own much quieter and notably less symbolically loaded process of physical decay in the Mesopotamian desert, almost entirely disconnected from the vivid metaphorical life its name had taken on within the wider cultural imagination of people who had, in the overwhelming majority of cases, never given any serious thought to what had actually happened to the real place at all. Systematic modern rediscovery of the physical site began in earnest with the work of Claudius James Rich, a British East India Company official stationed in Baghdad during the early 19th century, whose careful surveys and published descriptions of the ruins during the 1810s represented the first methodical modern documentation of the site, measuring visible mounds and collecting inscribed bricks and other artifacts that helped establish, for the first time in the modern era, that these scattered ruins in the Iraqi desert genuinely corresponded to the ancient city described in classical and biblical sources. Rich's own personal circumstances add a small human dimension to this early chapter of Babylon's rediscovery, a man working a demanding full-time colonial administrative post who nonetheless devoted his limited free time and personal funds to careful antiquarian survey work purely out of intellectual curiosity. His wife Mary Rich later publishing his collected papers and correspondence after his own early death from cholera in 1821, ensuring that his careful early observations survived to inform the far larger excavation efforts that would follow many decades later under Coldway's notably more extensive and better-funded direction. Rich's published accounts generated considerable scholarly interest across Europe, though the truly systematic, large-scale archaeological excavation that would ultimately reveal the site's full extent and significance did not begin until German archaeologist Robert Coldway arrived to lead an excavation campaign starting in 1899, sponsored by the German Oriental Society and continuing, with relatively few interruptions, for 18 years until the outbreak of the First World War finally forced the excavation team's departure from the region in 1917. Coldway's excavation methods represented a real advance over much of the archaeological practice common elsewhere in the region during this same period, employing systematic stratigraphic recording and careful architectural documentation, rather than the more haphazard treasure hunting approach that had characterized some earlier archaeological work across the wider Near East. An approach that allowed Coldway and his team to reconstruct Babylon's urban layout with a level of precision markedly beyond what earlier, less methodologically rigorous excavators working at other comparable sites had managed to achieve. Across his 18 years of continuous excavation, Coldway's team uncovered the Ishtar Gate, substantial sections of the processional way, the foundations of several major temple complexes including a Sagila and extensive residential districts, work that transformed Babylon from a place known primarily through classical and biblical literary description into a site whose actual physical archaeology could finally be examined, measured, and compared directly against those centuries of accumulated textual tradition. Coldway's excavation team faced genuine practical hardship throughout their 18-year campaign, working in extreme desert heat, managing large local workforces across shifting political circumstances in the final decades of Ottoman rule over the region, and coordinating the careful documentation and eventual transport of an enormous volume of recovered material back to Germany. Logistical challenges that make the sustained methodological rigor of the excavation's actual scientific output markedly more impressive in retrospect than a simple summary of its archaeological findings alone might convey. The team's detailed excavation notebooks, preserved and still consulted by researchers today, document not just what was found but the specific stratigraphic context in which each discovery emerged, a level of careful record-keeping that has allowed later generations of archaeologists to re-examine and reinterpret Coldway's original findings using analytical techniques and historical frameworks that simply did not exist during his own working lifetime. The local Iraqi workforce that made Coldway's excavation physically possible numbered, at peak periods, several hundred workers, laborers whose own accumulated practical expertise in careful earth-moving and artifact handling developed far across the project's 18 years. Several individuals eventually taking on really skilled supervisory roles within the excavation hierarchy despite receiving little formal recognition in the published scholarly record that would eventually make Coldway's own name internationally famous, a familiar and still not fully corrected imbalance in how credit for major archaeological discoveries has traditionally been distributed between the foreign scholars who directed excavation projects and the local workers who sustained physical labor and accumulated site-specific knowledge made those same projects actually achievable in practice. The Ishtar Gate's glazed brick panels, recovered by Coldway's team in thousands of individual fragments, underwent an extensive reconstruction process at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where German conservators spent years piecing together the shattered decorative tiles and eventually assembled a substantial reconstruction of the gate's lower portion, now displayed as one of the museum's central attractions and one of the most recognizable surviving artifacts from the entire ancient Near East, drawing visitors from around the world who often have little other context for ancient Mesopotamian civilization beyond this single striking blue and gold monument. The removal of these artifacts from Iraq to Germany, conducted under the terms of archaeological agreements common during this particular period of European colonial and semi-colonial involvement across the Middle East, has become, in more recent decades, a contested subject within the broader international conversation about cultural heritage repatriation. Iraqi cultural authorities periodically raising formal requests for the gate's eventual return, requests that German museum authorities have generally resisted, citing both the practical difficulty of relocating such an extensively reconstructed and now structurally integrated display and broader institutional concerns about establishing a precedent for repatriation claims affecting other major artifacts within the museum's much wider collection. A full-scale replica of the Ishtar Gate, much smaller and less detailed than the actual reconstructed panels housed in Berlin but still visually striking, was constructed at the original Babylon site itself, allowing visitors physically present at the ancient city to experience something approximating the gate's original scale and dramatic visual impact, even though the ancient tiles themselves remain permanently housed thousands of kilometers away in a European museum collection. This tension between preserving fragile ancient artifacts in climate-controlled museum settings equipped with the conservation resources necessary for their long-term survival, and returning cultural heritage to the communities and nations most directly connected to its original historical and cultural context, recurs throughout the broader history of Near Eastern archaeology during the colonial and immediate post-colonial periods, and Babylon's own Ishtar Gate stands as one of the most visible and most frequently cited examples of exactly this ongoing, unresolved international debate. The gate's specific physical condition when Coldway's team recovered it also complicates any simple repatriation proposal in ways that go beyond straightforward questions of national ownership, since the shattered glazed brick fragments required extensive laboratory reconstruction work that could only be conducted using equipment and expertise concentrated, at the time, almost exclusively within major European conservation institutions, meaning the gate as it exists today, a coherent, publicly displayable monument rather than a scattered heap of broken tile, is itself substantially a product of German conservation labor performed over many subsequent decades, a complicating factor that heritage repatriation debates involving less extensively reconstructed artifacts typically do not need to weigh so heavily. Whether this conservation history strengthens or weakens Germany's case for continuing to house the gate depends notably on which side of the broader repatriation debate a given observer already occupies, a disagreement that reflects deeper, still unresolved questions about who ultimately owns the physical legacy of ancient human achievement once modern national borders have redrawn the map surrounding where that achievement originally took place. Babylon's ancient legacy took an unusual and a great deal more recent political turn during the 1980s, when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein initiated an ambitious reconstruction program at the site, rebuilding sections of the ancient walls, palace structures, and other monuments using modern brick and construction methods. A project explicitly framed within Iraqi state propaganda as connecting Hussein's own rule to the glory of ancient Mesopotamian civilization and, more particularly still, drawing an implicit but unmistakable comparison between Hussein himself and Nebuchadnezzar, the legendary king whose own building achievements had made Babylon famous throughout the ancient world. Hussein went markedly further than simply funding reconstruction work, ordering that many of the new bricks used in this modern rebuilding effort be stamped with inscriptions explicitly commemorating his own name and rule, in some cases directly echoing the ancient practice, well documented in surviving cuneiform inscriptions, of Mesopotamian kings stamping their own names into bricks used in their major building projects, a deliberate act of historical self-insertion that struck many professional archaeologists and heritage preservation experts as a troubling conflation of legitimate historical preservation with transparent contemporary political propaganda. This reconstruction campaign drew sustained international archaeological criticism both for its methodological shortcomings, modern construction techniques and materials applied in ways that obscured or actively damaged the ability of future researchers to clearly distinguish authentic ancient structure from 20th century addition, and for the broader ethical concerns surrounding a modern authoritarian ruler explicitly using ancient heritage reconstruction as a tool of personal political legitimation, concerns that intensified considerably once later events made painfully clear just how much lasting physical damage this combination of political ambition and inadequate archaeological oversight had actually inflicted on the site's historical integrity. Hussein's plans for the site extended even further, including an unrealized proposal to construct a modern palace directly overlooking the ancient ruins, a building that was in fact partially completed before the broader political upheavals of the following decades intervened, leaving behind, alongside the reconstructed ancient walls themselves, a strange and only partially finished monument to one 20th century ruler's own ambition to associate himself permanently with one of history's most legendary ancient kings. Iraqi archaeologists working at the site during this period found themselves in a quite difficult professional position, aware of the methodological problems the reconstruction program was creating even as they operated within a political system that offered little practical space for open scientific objection to a project personally championed by the country's ruling authority. Some archaeological documentation from this specific period survives, showing internal professional concern about the reconstruction's approach, evidence that the problems later international critics identified were not invisible to Iraqi specialists at the time, even though those specialists possessed limited practical ability to redirect a state-sponsored project carrying this much direct political significance for the government funding it. This tension between professional archaeological judgment and political direction would recur, in a far more destructive form, only a couple of decades later when military occupation brought an entirely different set of external pressures to bear on the same physical site. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and the subsequent years of conflict brought entirely new and more severe forms of physical damage to the ancient site, when United States and Allied military forces established a large base, designated Camp Alpha, directly on and around portions of the archaeological remains. An operational decision that heritage preservation experts and Iraqi cultural authorities alike would later condemn in considerable detail once the full extent of the resulting damage became clear. Military vehicles moving across the site compacted and damaged archaeological layers across substantial areas, Heavy equipment excavated trenches and fortification positions directly through undisturbed ancient deposits that had survived intact for well over 2,000 years, and reports compiled by organizations including the British Museum, whose archaeologists conducted a formal damage assessment once military access to the site was eventually restored to civilian researchers, documented. Extensive harm, including damage to the reconstructed Ishtar Gate replica itself, disturbance to the ancient processional way, and the loss of archaeological context across areas that had never received proper scientific excavation before this military activity physically disturbed them. The circumstances surrounding the decision to establish a military base directly on such a significant archaeological site generated considerable international controversy and formal diplomatic protest once the extent of the damage became publicly known, military officials at the time defending the decision as reflecting practical operational necessity given the site's strategic location, while heritage preservation advocates and much of the international archaeological community characterized the choice as an avoidable and serious failure of basic cultural heritage protection during a period of active military occupation. This documented wartime damage added a much darker and more immediate chapter to Babylon's already long history of destruction and rebuilding, a modern military occupation causing measurable, scientifically documented harm to archaeological deposits that had survived every previous phase of the site's ancient decline, medieval obscurity, and even Saddam Hussein's own controversial mid-20th century reconstruction efforts relatively intact, evidence that the site's long survival across millennia offered no guarantee against the concentrated damage that modern military infrastructure could inflict within a comparatively brief period of active occupation. The British Museum's post-occupation damage assessment, led by archaeologist John Curtis and published in the years following the site's return to civilian archaeological control, documented specific findings that generated considerable international press attention at the time, including evidence that portions of the ancient site had been used for parking military vehicles and constructing helicopter landing areas, activities that compacted archaeological soil layers in ways that, unlike more localized excavation damage, affect an extensive horizontal area rather than a single concentrated point, making the resulting harm notably more difficult and more expensive to properly assess and eventually remediate than a comparable amount of damage concentrated in a smaller physical footprint would have been. Curtis's report explicitly stated that the specific choice to establish military infrastructure directly on unexcavated archaeological deposits represented an avoidable decision given the availability of nearby alternative locations, a conclusion that added considerable weight to subsequent international criticism of how the site had been managed during this period of active military use. Beyond the physical compaction and excavation damage, the report also documented contamination concerns arising from fuel and other military materials stored directly on archaeological ground, along with evidence that sandbags used to construct defensive positions had, in several documented locations, been filled using archaeologically significant soil scraped directly from the site itself, a detail that struck many reviewing archaeologists as particularly emblematic of how thoroughly basic cultural heritage awareness had been absent from the operational planning that placed a major military installation on top of one of the ancient world's most historically significant urban sites in the first place. Despite this accumulated damage spanning ancient conquest, gradual medieval decay, 20th century authoritarian reconstruction, and early 21st century military occupation, Babylon received formal recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019, a designation that Iraqi cultural authorities and international heritage organizations had pursued for years, delayed substantially by the extended periods of conflict and instability that had made sustained conservation planning and international coordination quite difficult to accomplish across much of the preceding decades. The formal nomination process itself required Iraqi heritage authorities to compile an extensive technical case demonstrating the site's outstanding universal value according to UNESCO-specific evaluative criteria, a bureaucratic undertaking markedly more demanding than simply pointing to the site's obvious historical fame, requiring detailed conservation management plans, boundary definitions, and evidence of sustained institutional capacity to protect the site going forward, precisely the kind of sustained administrative infrastructure that decades of conflict had made genuinely difficult for Iraqi institutions to maintain and document consistently. The UNESCO designation brought renewed international attention and, critically, renewed access to conservation funding and technical expertise that Iraqi heritage authorities had struggled to secure independently during the extended periods of conflict and economic sanctions that had constrained the country's own cultural preservation capacity across much of the preceding 3 decades, allowing more systematic conservation and stabilization work to finally begin addressing both the site's ancient deterioration and its more recent, documented wartime damage. Ongoing conservation challenges at the site remain considerable. The same mud brick construction technique that made ancient Babylonian architecture achievable at the enormous scale Nebuchadnezzar's building program required also makes the surviving structures inherently vulnerable to water damage, seasonal flooding, and the kind of gradual erosion that any exposed earthen architecture inevitably experiences without continuous, carefully managed conservation intervention, a maintenance burden notably heavier than what comparable stone architecture elsewhere in the ancient world typically requires to remain stable and accessible to visitors and researchers alike. Iraqi archaeologists and heritage professionals, working increasingly independently of the kind of foreign-led excavation projects that characterized the site's earlier modern investigation under Rich and Coldway, now lead ongoing research and conservation efforts at Babylon, part of a broader, deliberate shift across Iraqi cultural heritage policy toward building sustained domestic archaeological capacity and ensuring that decisions about how to study, preserve, and eventually present sites of this magnitude to the public rest substantially with Iraqi institutions and Iraqi researchers themselves rather than remaining primarily directed by international teams operating according to priorities set largely outside the country. This shift toward domestic institutional leadership has coincided with growing international academic collaboration conducted on a great deal more equal footing than the arrangements common during the colonial and early post-colonial periods. Joint Iraqi international research projects now typically structured around shared authorship, shared decision-making authority over excavation priorities, and explicit commitments to keeping the great majority of recovered artifacts within Iraq itself, rather than exporting them abroad, a set of working principles that stands in deliberate, pointed contrast to the arrangements under which the Ishtar Gate itself left the country more than a century earlier. Younger Iraqi archaeologists trained under these newer collaborative frameworks increasingly occupy senior research and management positions at Babylon and at comparable major sites across the country, a generational transition that heritage policy experts widely view as essential to ensuring the site's long-term stewardship reflects really Iraqi priorities and Iraqi expertise rather than continuing to depend primarily on periodic foreign intervention. Funding for this ongoing conservation work remains a persistent practical challenge despite the increased attention the UNESCO designation has brought, Iraqi government cultural heritage budgets competing against numerous other pressing national priorities in a country still working to rebuild infrastructure and institutional capacity across many sectors following decades of conflict and economic sanctions, meaning international partnership funding, however welcome and however more equitably structured than in earlier historical periods, continues playing a necessary role in sustaining the kind of consistent, long-term conservation investment that a site of Babylon's scale and complexity requires simply to prevent further deterioration, let alone to expand the pace of new research and public interpretation work that heritage professionals working at the site would ideally like to pursue. Visitors to Babylon today encounter a site that requires, more than most comparable ancient ruins elsewhere in the world, real effort to properly read and interpret layers of authentic ancient construction interspersed with Saddam Hussein's controversial modern reconstruction work, sections damaged by 21st-century military occupation, and the replica Ishtar Gate standing in for the ancient tiles now permanently housed in Berlin, a physical palimpsest of destruction, reconstruction, and further destruction that captures, in its own layered complexity, the full span of this city's remarkable and difficult history. The reconstructed sections of ancient wall that Hussein's government built during the 1980s now stand as their own kind of historical artifact, evidence not of ancient Babylonian construction technique but of a 20th century authoritarian regime's own particular relationship to ancient history. Brick stamped with a modern dictator's name standing alongside brick genuinely laid down by workers serving Nebuchadnezzar's court, two very different rulers separated by roughly 25 centuries but united by a shared instinct to inscribe their own names permanently into the same enduring building material. What makes Babylon's history so instructive, beyond the simple fact of the ancient city's own remarkable achievements, is how thoroughly the site's more recent history demonstrates that even a location this ancient, this well-documented, and this thoroughly studied by professional archaeology remains vulnerable to exactly the same combination of political ambition, military conflict, and simple institutional neglect that has damaged and distorted countless other archaeological sites across the modern world. A reminder that ancient survival across millennia offers no permanent guarantee against much more recent and much more preventable forms of harm. The processional way that Nebuchadnezzar's subjects once walked during the annual Akitu festival, carrying statues of Marduk in elaborate public procession beneath walls covered in glazed brick lions, remains partially traceable today, weathered and markedly diminished from its ancient splendor, but still recognizable to visitors willing to look past the accumulated layers of subsequent history that now surround it. A fragment of real continuity connecting the ancient ceremonial heart of the world's most famous ancient city to whoever still walks that same ground today. Local Iraqi guides working at the site today often carry personal and family connections to the region stretching back multiple generations, some describing relatives who worked on Coldway's original excavation team more than a century ago, a living thread of institutional memory that connects the site's earliest scientific investigation directly to its present-day interpretation for visitors. A continuity that exists alongside, and in its own quiet way somewhat softens, the much more dramatic ruptures of destruction and reconstruction that dominate the site's more headline-grabbing modern history. Visitors who take the time to speak with these guides often come away with a notably richer understanding of Babylon's full arc than the site's physical ruins alone could provide, a human dimension to the story that connects ancient Mesopotamian kingship all the way through to the ordinary Iraqi families who have, across multiple generations now, made their own living helping outsiders understand exactly what happened on this particular stretch of desert ground. Tourism to the site has grown steadily in recent years as broader security conditions across the surrounding region have gradually stabilized, Iraqi cultural authorities working to balance a true desire to welcome increased visitor numbers, both domestic and international, against the practical conservation reality that heavier foot traffic across fragile mud brick structures inevitably accelerates the same kind of gradual physical wear that has challenged the site's preservation across its entire multi-thousand-year history, a balancing act that every well-visited ancient site around the world faces in some form, but that carries particular weight at Babylon given how much damage the site has already absorbed across its documented modern history alone. Tonight, the low mounds of Babylon still rise from the Iraqi plain, holding within them the accumulated evidence of nearly 4,000 years of continuous human history, Hammurabi's early legal foundations, Sennacherib's deliberate destruction and Esarhaddon's equally deliberate restoration, Nebuchadnezzar's glazed blue gates and his still debated hanging gardens. The slow centuries of gradual abandonment as Seleucia and later cities drew away the population and prestige that had once concentrated here. And finally, the layered 20th and 21st century history of authoritarian reconstruction and military occupation that has left its own permanent, physical mark on ground already carrying millennia of accumulated history before any of these more recent events ever occurred. Isaiah's ancient prophecy that Babylon would never again be inhabited, that no shepherd would rest a flock among its ruins, found its fulfillment not through any single dramatic act of destruction, but through exactly the kind of slow, cumulative process this entire account has traced: trade routes shifting, capitals relocating, population gradually drifting toward newer centers of political and commercial gravity until one of history's most legendary cities simply stopped mattering to the practical daily business of running an empire, its walls left standing but increasingly empty, its temples maintained by fewer and fewer priests until even that dwindling religious activity finally ceased entirely sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. What survives now is neither purely ancient nor purely modern, but some complicated combination of both. Authentic Neo-Babylonian brick standing alongside Saddam Hussein's own inscribed modern additions, ancient processional ways disturbed by 21st-century military vehicles, and a replica gate welcoming visitors to a site whose most famous original artifact sits permanently displayed in a museum thousands of kilometers away, a physical record as layered and as quite difficult to fully untangle as the city's own long, winding, and repeatedly interrupted history. Every layer of that record still has something to say to anyone patient enough to read it in order. Hammurabi's careful legal proportionality, Nebuchadnezzar's glazed blue ambition, the quiet scholarly persistence of the last astronomer priests still tracking the star centuries after anyone else had stopped paying the city much attention at all, and finally the much louder, considerably more recent layers stamped by a modern dictator and scarred by a modern war, each one a genuine part of the same unbroken 4,000-year record now waiting patiently in the desert for whoever comes next. The city that gave its name to human overreach in the Tower of Babel, to exile and longing in the Psalms of a displaced people, and to corrupt worldly excess in the Book of Revelation's final apocalyptic vision, outlasted every one of those symbolic afterlives as an actual physical place, brick and mud brick and glazed tile slowly settling back into the desert floor that first provided the material for its rise. Patient enough, in the end, to still be here, waiting for anyone willing to walk out into the Iraqi sun and look. Somewhere beneath the still unexcavated portions of the wider site, sections of the ancient city that even Coldway's 18 years of dedicated work never reached, more of Babylon's actual history almost certainly waits, administrative archives that might finally settle the Hanging Gardens question one way or the other, residential quarters that could reveal much more about how ordinary Babylonians actually lived beneath the more heavily documented world of kings and priests, evidence that future generations of archaeologists, working with resources and methods not yet available to anyone currently walking this ground, may eventually recover and interpret in ways no one alive today can fully anticipate. The mounds are still there. The desert has kept its patience for 4,000 years already. It can evidently keep it a while longer, for whoever eventually comes looking with the right questions and the right tools to finally answer them. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.